Romans chapter 8 verse 28 says this, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose." Now, what I want to get at in this study, we could go many directions with this verse, but what I want to get at least at the surface level, is this truth, that God can remain good in the midst of suffering and evil because He plans and uses that evil for our good and for His glory. Sometimes we think that God can, we affirm, God can use our good times to bless us. Absolutely, but oftentimes we begin to question how God can remain good even in the hardships, in the distresses, in the daily struggles of life. But that's the beautiful promise here that Paul gives in chapter 8, verse 28, when he says all things work together for good. Not just the easy times and the comfortable times when you're healthy or prosperous, but when you are poor, when you are in distress, when you face persecution, when you're weak. As we looked at in 2 Corinthians, God's power is made perfect in weakness. Not that it's lacking anything, but rather it means that it's displayed in all of its sufficiency best in our weakness. When He provides, He shows up and shows that He is our strength, that He's the one sustaining us, not ourselves. Let me give you a couple examples of this truth that God can remain good in the midst of suffering because He plans and uses that suffering for good. Number one, the story of Joseph. It starts in Genesis chapter 37, and in just a brief little summary, basically Joseph was hated by his brothers. His brothers one day plotted against him. First, they tried to throw him into a well and that he would die. But they saw a group passing by, and they decided to sell him into slavery. And so he ends up in Egypt. He faces a lot of temptations, trials. He's put in prison. But then, there are a lot of things. He interprets the Pharaoh's dreams because God had given that gift to him, and he ends up being second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. And so this famine comes, and God warns Joseph ahead of time. Because he's second in command, he can do this, and he can tell Pharaoh to do this, and Pharaoh's going to listen. And there was a famine throughout all countries that says, yes, even the Jewish people faced this famine, and it was going to be really bad. And so God warns Joseph and says, hey, look, you need to store up all the food that you can right now so that you're going to have plenty to sustain life when, this famine hits. And so he does, and what do you know? His brothers are part of a group that often comes to him for food. And, to make the story short, Genesis 50 verse 20, Joseph says this to his brothers: "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to save many people alive." Now, in the Old Testament, Israel was God's chosen people, okay? And through this famine, God preserved Israel by the hand of Joseph because of what had happened to Joseph when he was sold into slavery. And what I'm saying is that none of this would have ever happened. Israel would have died off if Joseph had never been sold into slavery, if that evil intended by his brothers had never been committed, because if he was not sold into slavery, he would have never been second in command to Pharaoh, and therefore would have never had the authority to save up all this food, etc. So God used that evil that was done to Joseph, a man following God, and used it for good, to save the whole nation of Israel. So He used one man's suffering actually for the good of a lot of people. My second example, and the most important example I can possibly give, is God allowed himself, get this, God allowed himself to be tortured and spit upon by the very ones he created in order to defeat our sin, so we could be saved. You know, you've heard it said that Jesus defeated death through death. He tasted death for us so that we could have life, in other words. He traded his perfect life for our sin, in other words. He took our punishment upon himself so we could be forgiven. He was condemned so we could have our case dismissed and we could walk out of the courtroom. We could have our death sentence commuted, and we wouldn't have to go to God's prison, which is hell, without parole. And so God used the most evil act in history, namely the crucifixion of the innocent Son of God, and used it for good. So what I'm saying is God can remain good even in the midst of suffering and evil, because his heart is always, he always does things with a good intention. He always does it for a good purpose, out of pure motivation. He does it for his glory and his people's ultimate good.